Hello and welcome back to Processing the Process, where we capture and discuss the technical, psychological, and contextual dynamics that shape the process of creating a work of art. Week by week, moment by moment, we're following Jonathan Riddell, choreographer and artistic director of Riddell Dance Theater, as he creates his latest works for RDT's Second Story Dance project and delves into new creative territory. Today, we have a very special 2-for-1 videocast. We will first talk a bit about the latest and greatest update with your World Run Red, hard for me to say, album. Mm-hmm. We'll go from that into our December 5th rehearsal, which was in preparation for the Mamaroneck Arts Council's Art Life event on December the 9th. So we're bringing the whole thing to you. And actually, I think it will provide a really neat process perspective, actually, by doing it together. So you are in for a treat. And we'll begin today with the latest album development. Now, this did come as a surprise to me, I must say.
I like to keep you on your toes, Sherry.
Oh, and he does. I can assure you of that. When he informed me, I wrote and recorded another song as my jaw dropped. Oh, really? I thought you had finished your World Run Red album, but interesting concepts emerged from our conversation about it.
Yeah.
And John was explaining to me that he thought that this song might actually work within the World Run Red album to flesh out its narrative through line. So for the beginning of the album, we know that the main character is figuring out who he is, coming to that understanding and that
and
more grounded
with
place.
The world. Yeah.
But also wrestling with his place in the world as his authentic self. And this new song, John, you explained, really addresses that piece of it in greater depth. And you thought perhaps then it might make sense to have that precede the Day I Blacked Out All My Dreams song, where, you know, he's wrestling with his place in the world. And at that point, I think feeling somewhat hopeless and fearing that he's not going to figure it out and maybe he should just forget about anything that he had hoped, and it's kind of there's kind of a bleakness there. And you explained, though, that you had an alternative idea. Of course, there's always a part two.
Always plan B, C, and D, yeah.
Where you might really develop this idea in such a way that it becomes a whole nother album. Yeah. You said that would be a complement to World Run Red. I'll never get that. Where the entire album deals with the character's struggle to find his place in the world while remaining authentic. And you also pointed something out to me I had not really thought about, that a lot of albums do feature 10 songs and your current album has 8. So this potentially could be number 9, and with one more, you might really be able to flesh out the narrative more fully. So it can kind of go either way. Yeah. What are your thoughts about it at this point?
So I'm very happy with the album as is. So if it just stays that way, then yay, I think it's great. I'm very proud of it, and it does say so much of what I want it to. In terms of its length, a typical album by contemporary standards, how contemporary are we talking? But I'm talking like 20th and 21st century. is like around 10 songs is kind of how I look at it, sort of an average. I do think nowadays, particularly in the last 10 years, if not more, recording artists are making longer albums with many more songs. There's always been the double, what we used to call the double LP, back when we're talking about LPs and
Yes,
records.
I do.
And then you'd get like 17, 18 tracks. But a typical one record album was generally around 10. Then you'd have, but I'm not a fan of having, I don't want any extra stuff. I don't want any filler.
Right.
I often think so many albums today are too long because, as artists try and push for 14, 15 tracks. I often, on so many albums I'm like, oh, there are 9, 10 solid songs here. Like, those would be fine. I'd be happy with just those. So I'm not looking to expand this project in any way that doesn't have meaning to me.
Exactly.
I like a punchy little album. So 8 tracks, though, is definitely on the short side of things. But maybe that's fine. So at any rate, this song came to me, and I always felt like in the arc of the album, the way the songs are ordered now, it's great, but there's sort of just a tiny bit of a narrative jump for me from So Runs the Beast to The Day I Blacked Out All My Dreams. It works fine. It works sonically fine. It sounds great, but just in terms of fleshing out the ideas. So I thought, well, wouldn't it be cool if this song that's sort of coming to me fit nicely right in between them? And I think it really does. So I'm happy about that. I'm sure that as I was forming the song, I tried to not make too many conscious decisions about having it fit in perfectly, because I wanted the song to be it needs to be its own self no matter what. So ultimately, whether it does wind up on the album or become part of another project is great by me. I didn't want to force it in any one particular direction. I want to flesh it out and make sure it really has a life of its own. And then if indeed it winds up fitting where I think it might on the album, great. So but what might this other project be? I kind of thought, wow, wouldn't maybe instead of expanding my 8-track album to 9 or 10 songs, what if it had a complement album to it? Maybe another 8, so it's maybe 2 small albums, but they kind of fit nicely together. Maybe they could be, maybe they could fit in a box set together, kind of a thing. Maybe they could fit in a double LP together. But maybe one is Act 1 and the other is Act 2, kind of a thing. So I'm kind of seeing how this song develops and sort of what my next ideas for songs are, and to see if I'm truly exploring these similar ideas and could make another album in this direction, or if my muse is really just going to take me in a whole new direction, in which case, again, I don't want to force anything. So maybe this song will fit in with my new songs and can be a new album, or maybe this song does belong with my old album. I can now talk about having an old album.
Wow.
Or maybe it's its own single. Who knows? We kind of need to see what it does.
But would you say, I'm thinking, as you've described in the past, and we've spoken about on videocasts, when you're talking about choreographing, when you're speaking about writing, whatever the genre happens to be, you've always spoken about the primacy of the story.
Yes.
And might we say the primacy of the psychological and emotional arc, let's say. Would this be the case, once again, where that ultimately determines your decisions? Did this tell the story the way you wanted it to? Or how do I really want to tell this story? I'm getting more ideas about ways to tell the story. How deeply and broadly do I want to examine these psychological and emotional issues using this character?
Yeah.
I wonder if these are the same kinds of fundamental questions that you would be asking yourself regardless of the genre you were working in.
Absolutely. The primacy of the story is always a huge benchmark for me. It's a huge determining factor for so many of my artistic decisions.
Right.
It's a big part of my inspiration as to how the project will continue to evolve, or how any project evolves. And so a lot of that is going into decisions I make about this song. When I say I still need to flesh out the song, it's about the subtle details of the track, and I don't want to make those decisions in terms of like, does the song climax at the end, or does it climax in the middle and then kind of denouement, fade out kind of thing. I could force those decisions about the micro decisions about the song itself. I could force those so that it fits into the album in a particular way. I don't want to do that. I want those micro decisions about the song to be true to the song itself. And then how it fits into the album.
Right.
I could then make minor tweaks here and there to have it fit the album nicely, just flow from one song to the next, kind of a thing. So I guess what I'm saying is now I'm at the point where I'm focused just on the song itself.
Right. Exactly.
And I have these notions of where it could fit into a larger work, either in World Run Red or in a new project. But absolutely, I'm not going to put it in World Run Red if it doesn't make sense to that project. Right now, it's looking like it does. I think it sounds great. It's got enough similarities to the other songs that it feels akin to them, but it's also very different. It's got kind of got a laid back samba beat, which none of the other tracks do. It's got this, and then yet has this sort of searing synthesizer line that's sort of unique to the other tracks.
Right.
So it definitely adds something to the album if it goes on there, and that's exciting.
Absolutely.
And then in terms of content of the song, this I kind of look at it as the darkest song on the album in terms of what it's talking about, which is funny because so many of the songs are already pretty bleak.
I was going to say,
or pretty angry or pretty
black.
aggressive. But this is really like a pit of despair kind of a song. In terms of what it's talking about, the beat is kind of dancey and fun, and it's got this great groove to it, and I love that juxtaposition. That I could see people in a dance hall just like, and it's sexy in a way, and I could see people just sweating and with a drink in their hand and grooving with other people, and but then the lyrics are, it's talking about this sort of boogeyman, basically, and which is, in my mind, a metaphor for depression and despair. And the character in the song is finding himself trapped. In one verse, he's completely tied up and bound. In another verse, he's sinking into the ocean. In another verse, he's just alone at a bar, but completely connecting to nobody in the bar, so he feels completely alone. And the entire time, he's anticipating the coming of this boogeyman. So it's scary. It's scary.
Indeed.
It scares me. It's scary in a way. It doesn't talk much about any hope of getting out of this situation. It's pretty much like I'm trapped and this darkness is coming. It's a darkness that I know, and it's a darkness I can feel encroaching upon me, and I'm scared about when it arrives as to how it's going to make me feel. So that's all really, that's bleak stuff.
But it's
and
authentic.
And it is authentic. It does come from a true feelings that I have, and a period in my life where I felt this way often, which is sad to admit, hard to admit, but it's true. And I've touched upon some of these ideas and some of these feelings in the other songs, but in the other songs I feel like there is always a perspective shift. For example, The Day I Blacked Out All My Dreams, certainly that title is pretty dark and bleak.
I'd say so.
But I feel like that song is also about, it talks about that day as being in the past and running from that day, the day I blacked out all my dreams. And you don't know if the character is now running to his dreams or saying, I've blacked them out and I'm going, and now I'm searching for what's next. Regardless, he's moving forward, at least. This song is trapped. It's a song about being trapped. So, but I think it does bridge So Runs the Beast.
Right.
Which is this transformational sort of embracing the primal self and the dark side. And then if the songs went in this order, we would then have this song that expresses, and now that I've sort of made this transformation and exploring these feelings, oh, there's a real darkness there. And then the third song in that order is The Day That I Blacked Out All My Dreams, and now I'm running from it. So that makes a logical progression to me. That makes an emotional progression to me. Musically, the three songs sound great in that order. So I'm very hopeful as to what this song could do for the album. I feel like I've been talking a lot, but that's why we're here.
Absolutely.
I would say my one sort of point that I'm wrestling with it is it's another funky dance track, which I love. I love that it does that, but it's another dark song on this album, and I feel like the album had this nice balance of darkness and fun. And while this song again has this fun beat and groove to it, it's really not, in terms of content, it's not fun. And it sort of then tips the balance of the album into the dark side. So that's where I kind of have to see how, if the arc of the album then becomes sort of so bleak, that I want to move people. I want people to be provoked to think about these things. I don't want to dive people into despair. I don't want this to be like an album that you put on only when you are in a dark mood.
Having a hard time.
So I have to, those are some of the judgment calls I need to make going forward.
And maybe you'll find that it's more of a wave as opposed to balance, which suggests an overall tilt in one direction. And you've always been very careful, whether it is here constructing an album, whether I'm thinking of your Sweet of Grief dances that you had begun to put together, where you're always thinking of the balance between each dance or each song as a standalone work of art, making sure that it is complete in and of itself, and then how does this one piece fit into the bigger puzzle? And it seems to me you're always juggling that one way or the other, and that's your criteria ultimately.
That's what I like.
That's what you're figuring out, and that's what he's in the process of determining. But what a treat for us to be able to hear you kind of take us through the thought processes involved in these kinds of decisions. And we will certainly keep you posted about what John decides, and I'm sure there will be much, much more besides this set of issues.
And always remember, the album as it stands now is currently out there to be enjoyed and shared and listened to and danced to. So, and as you said, it is a complete work unto itself. Absolutely. It is an 8-song cycle, an album of 8 songs that are dancey and then soulful and introspective, and there are the ballads on there, and so it's great because it is already an existing thing, and then I can decide if I want to make the deluxe version, which is again a big thing people do now. They release the deluxe version of albums with bonus songs, and so I have that freedom to play.
And might that also remind us that any work of art is a living, breathing, growing thing, if you will, that can continue to grow in ways that we can't necessarily foresee, but that in fact make themselves known. So indeed, if that occurs, we will be sharing it with you and have sort of this up close perspective on process, which is really, for me, wonderful. So stay tuned for that. But at this point, we are going to move into the December 5th rehearsal, which was the last one before our Art Life event, and a special one, as you're about to discover. Essentially, our objective here was to run through each of the pieces that would be performed at Art Life in the order in which they would be danced. And then each choreographer would give his or her final notes, generally with regard to qualitative details and so forth, for each piece. So we began with Lorena's voices, both section 1, which is the duet, followed by section 2, which is Mandy's solo. And then we moved on to the piece that Mandy choreographed for Lorena. And before we went to Embers and Ash, it just happened that the conversation about costumes emerged again. Should we wear them? Should we not? And because this particular show was really what you call, John, a lecture demonstration, you don't necessarily have to wear costumes. So we were going back and forth, and Lorena ultimately felt like, I really want to wear the costumes for my piece Voices that we did before. And then if they were going to wear Voices costumes, then it would make sense that they would have costumes for all the pieces. But what I found interesting, John, is that you seem to be somewhat neutral on the subject, that you could go either way, costumes or not. So is that typical, where you kind of don't come down on one side of the or the other of a decision?
I can be very diplomatic. No, I think in this particular context, this particular venue, it would make total sense to me that we would just go in simple black attire, very neutral dance clothing, and perform these works. It's an informal setting. there's discussion about the works. It's sort of it's sort of inviting the audience into the rehearsal process in a way, even though we're not showing them. I've done demonstrations where we show them works that are in progress of being made, or we actually show a director or choreographer giving us notes and us taking them, and so you're showing the audience what an actual rehearsal looks like and feels like live. In this case, we were showing completed pieces, but it still was, again, in that informal setting. So I've done many like that where we don't bring out the full costumes. Sometimes bringing out the full costumes means a lot. It means, putting on apparatuses and big velour things and headpieces and makeup. So that's not always called for, especially in a small setting. And it's always, I think, if you have the opportunity as an audience member to see an informal viewing, and then go see the stage viewing, and to see, you then get these sort of two different views of the piece, and to see a piece that you might normally see with costumes, either elaborate or very simple but effective, to then see it done in just simple black clothing where you really just focus on the movement and the artist's expression. It's sort of the very pure essence of dance. That can be captivating, that can be fascinating. You see things that you wouldn't normally see, because the costumes either cover things up or spin your perspective or change the line a little bit. So I think it's totally valid to do both or either. So I was very open to just doing blacks. Then there was more talk about costumes. We had just performed Embers and Ash, so the costumes were there and beautiful. And
Brittle Branches.
Brittle Branches, sorry, yes.
Right.
And so it was kind of like, well, why not? And they are simple enough that the ladies could just change into them quickly. And
yes.
So we went back and forth on that, and then and I ultimately let the dancers make the decision. And I think, as you said, we were kind of going back and forth, and finally Laurie was like, well, I want my piece to be in costume, so it makes sense that we have costumes throughout. And so sure, I'll put on the Brittle Branches costume and I'll dance that for you. And I was like, great, no problem, there you go.
And it looked beautiful.
It
did,
I have to say. I was proud.
It really did. And it was a relief, I think, at that point to just finally have the decision made, although we ran out of time, so it had to be made one way or the other, of course, at that point. And then we were able to move into having John practice Embers and Ash. And because he's the choreographer for his own piece, he asked Lorena to watch the piece and give him notes. And there were just a couple, but I'm curious as to how John processed those notes, which were essentially that she felt John's focus was particularly good at this stage. His hand movements were even bigger and more pronounced than ever. And she had a pretty key suggestion for you, John, in terms of, you begin Embers and Ash for I don't know how many minutes, where your lower body is in essence still. And then you take a couple of tentative first steps, which makes sense for your character. But Laurie felt, gee, could you create more of a transition from those couple of first tentative steps to the point where you're really full out dancing using your entire lower body? So what were your thoughts at this point? Now it's interesting because you're usually thinking about whether or not to add a qualitative detail here or there right before a show with your dancers, and now
Here's
Lori
the
was
dancer.
making this
Making
kind
that-
of suggestion to you that might require tweaking
rejiggering, yeah.
choreography. So what was that like?
I
Tables
tried
were
not to
turned.
freak out. I tried to keep calm. It was fine. It was a suggestion that made total sense to me. It's something that I had always considered in the dance, but Lori sort of pointed out that as the dance has evolved, maybe I should take a look at that moment again, to make sure. As things evolve, sometimes you can evolve one part and then you forget, like, oh, but remember the beginning? Like, now that the ending's different, you should maybe adjust the beginning slightly so it makes sense with the ending, that kind of a thing. So here was this moment that maybe could use some attention, given that I had shifted things throughout the rest of the dance. And I think I quickly understood that she was looking just for something, one or two minor things. It wasn't like, oh yeah, you need to really change that whole section.
Right.
So we're talking about minor changes, something that I could perhaps play with quickly, and just make a few mental notes and still be able to pull out in a performance. And that's all. Talking about changes to my works that I ask of my dancers, I try to limit it to just simple things. It's not going to rock your world while you're on stage, but just in that part, can you remember to do this, make this change? And I think we'll talk about. I did ask that of them for this show too, of course, because there's always something. So anyway, yes, Lori was asking me about this, and I think ultimately, I remember, I'm trying to remember that day exactly, I did try to play with some actual changes of the steps, and she was responding well to them as I was showing them to her. But ultimately, when we talked about what was important, we both kind of agreed that maybe it was just a matter of intention, that maybe the steps didn't have to change, but how I attacked the steps, how the energy and emotion I put into the steps at that moment could just convey that tentativeness of the character, that these are sort of the first Bambi steps, as the deer is stepping up before it can run. So don't be too commanding, don't be too powerful in your strides. And then when I kind of just did that, I just sort of shifted the energy of it. She said, "Oh, I think that's good," and I think, and I believe that's ultimately what I did and what I did in the show. And it's always fascinating to me. I always talk about how intention and energy is so important.
Yes.
But then when I am directing myself and looking at myself, I so often forget at the power of that as I direct myself, and so it was really good to have an outside eye talk to me about that, particularly in that moment.
Exactly. But he got him back. And
Then I had my review.
Exactly, as they move to the last piece, the run through brittle branches, but prior to the actual run through, Jonathan wanted to make one more little change, seemingly little, but that would have, in your view, I think, tremendous impact to in a part of or a section in which Lorena and Mandy are dancing in unison, and you wanted to add, I think, a little more visual interest by changing the angles at which each of the dancers were doing this particular movement.
Yes.
You can explain much better than I, but you really had this strong feeling that that was going to make an important difference, and so the ladies did agree to incorporate it in the run through. And were you? I think you were pleased.
I was thrilled.
Right?
I was thrilled. It was something. it was just one little change. It was one little change that evolved into two little changes. It's a moment in the dance, if you've seen it out there, America, world, where the ladies are doing a lot of movement in unison together on the floor, and they shoot out into a plank position. And I've always felt like at that moment, always, or much earlier on in the process than now, I thought, wouldn't it be great if they shot out in different directions? But for whatever reason in the process, it just felt like it wasn't the right choice at the time. And in the process too, like they were relying on visually connecting with each other so much to really be in unison. I didn't want to mess that up.
Right.
But now that we had performed it once, and I was confident that they felt grounded enough in the movement that I could ask for a tweak. I was like, guys, it would really look amazing if you shot out in two different directions, if we started to break up this completely cookie cutter unison, and so but subtly, so it's just now one person's this way, one person's this way. And then as they continued on the movement, before they get up off the floor and go to a whole new section, I was like, oh, and then if this, and now that looks so good. As you're rolling, Lori, when you come up, could you completely face the other way? And then transition back into what you did. And she was able to physicalize that and make that work. And it was the right thing. It starts to, it adds the visual interest. It shifts that cookie cutter unison at just the right moment, that this sort of very formalness in the dance starts to break up, and then then they wind up dancing two totally different things in the next section. Right. So it starts to, it's like a very formal thing starting to crack and shift and then crumble into two different directions. So to me, it's so much more poetic. It climaxes with the music that much more. It just, and I was so happy when I saw it, and I was like, again, I'm so sorry to ask for changes at this point, but it really serves the piece. And I think when, at any point, even if I were tentative about it, I know that they would be good sports, good professionals, and they would do it. But it just helps so much when I know it's the right decision, I can be confident about it, and I can clearly convey to them, guys, it's so worth it. You know, it's worth that extra mental and physical energy to make this shift. So let's go for it. And they did, and it was beautiful.
It was great, and at that point, John then just reviewed essentially the agenda of the Art Life show, so everyone would be on the same page, understanding the flow of the afternoon. And finally, Lorena confirmed to Jonathan, Mandy, and me that the Art Life event might very well be her final one as a member of Second Story, since she has entered into a new business partnership, which we have mentioned to you before. So for the foreseeable future, that is really going to take up all of her time, and hard to see, beyond the near term as to whether or not she would be able to rejoin Second Story. So, we knew this was likely, and then suddenly at this rehearsal, it really becomes real.
Yeah.
And we collectively realized, oh gosh, this may be the final Second Story rehearsal. And I know, John, as it started hitting you, a little bit earlier when you were watching the ladies practice brittle branches, and you were thinking, oh God, this might be the last time I see them rehearse brittle branches. And it really was an emotional moment.
Yeah.
And I think that's a good segue as we pull the lens back a bit at this point and take a look at the fact that we are really entering into a transition period now. And I wanted to tap into your preliminary feelings about it as it begins and see if you can think back to your Limon days and your days with RDT when perhaps a project was coming to an end or there was some kind of transition, and how that felt and how you handled it, you know, maybe compare and contrast a little bit with what's happening now?
That's a very interesting question. You know, I think particularly in the Limon days, and I think in my RDT days, there's always so much to think about and do and work on that it's very easy to just keep rolling, and ultimately that's what you do. I mean, it's the show must go on, and even when you're saying goodbye to a beloved, almost irreplaceable person, the truth is in showbiz, while people are irreplaceable in their uniqueness, there is always either the next project or the next person coming in to at least try to fill that person's shoes. And so you are then focused on the next thing or the next person, and you know, there's always work to do. So I very rarely would stop to consider transitions and changes.
Interesting.
And again, not for any loss of love for anyone. It's the opposite. But again, it was like, okay, well, shift, change. Like it's also, you know, especially in dance and any art, change is constant. Like you said, it's ever evolving.
Yes.
You're always having new notes, new things to work on, or something to overcome, some shift that day. Maybe you have a cold that day, so now you're focused on how do I give my peak performance with a cold. You know, there's always something. So it's very easy to be distracted and not think about those life transitions. I think it was actually very atypical of me to have that taken aback moment in the rehearsal, as I did watching Mandy and Lori, and just go, oh my God, this is the last run through of this piece with these dancers who have been creating this piece with me for 2 years, and have been, and certainly now are more than ever dear, beloved friends of mine. And I think maybe because our process and our project has been so sparse and spread out, I have the room now to have an emotional reaction to such an event. You know, there isn't the next project just immediately coming. There isn't another dancer immediately coming to fill in. I really could sort of go, oh, right, this is a goodbye. And I'm not saying goodbye to Lorena, my dear friend. I'm not even saying goodbye to her truly as a colleague. There will be more adventures for us, I know. But in this project, this thing that we started and created together, this is a goodbye. This is a closing of this chapter.
Right.
And yeah, it hit me. It did hit me. And I didn't break down sobbing or anything in the middle of rehearsal, but I did want to mention it to them, and I was also struck by, Jonathan, you're having an emotion about this. How strange.
Well, and of course, I drag you in front of the camera every week to process the process. So
now for posterity and all time, it is recorded that Jonathan had an emotion in rehearsal. It's good for him.
Indeed. And that actually is a nice segue, I think, into the show, because I say it was filled with all kinds of emotions for all kinds of reasons. So here we are on December 9th at the Mamaroneck Public Library, where the event took place. But as seems to be typical, leading into the show, there were a number of external challenges, and you're really going to like the first one. Poor John was sick in bed for a long time leading into the show. And I mean in bed. So Jonathan vowed to us that he will get out of bed and he will dance Embers and Ash no matter what. So, but this was, we're saying, okay, right.
But it kind of meant that team, I need you to kind of have my back on everything else, because I have just enough energy to get up and do this one dance. That's kind of all I got.
Like fingers and toes crossed, of course. At the same time, I was under the weather, but not as sick as John. So we made this executive decision, essentially, that I would do Jonathan's introductory remarks in addition to my speaking about the process of creating each of the pieces. And just kept my fingers crossed that I'd remain standing.
It really comes down to, like, not only, okay, so you're sick, but how sick are you?
Exactly.
Let's get into detail.
And it was a triage kind of situation here. Then we discovered later that Lorena's husband had to go back for their costumes.
Oh, that's right.
That he had left. And Mandy had to bring her younger son, Nate, with her as she was getting ready, which, from a couple years of doing Second Story,
it's kind of par for the course.
Par for the course, but still no easy feat. Thankfully, though.
Well, and I was supposed to bring my kids, Edgar and Eliza, to this show. And then, and that was also part of, like, the I'm sick as a dog and I'm going to have my 2 kids with me. So,
right.
Luckily, and because I was so sick, my sister, bless you, love you. Hi, Lisa.
Yes, thank you, Lisa.
She was like, wait, you are doing your show today and you're so sick. Do you want me to take your kids for you? And I was like, thank you so much. That would be amazing. So we did a last-minute babysitting configuration, and I was actually sad to not have my kids there at this sort of very important goodbye to Second Story show. But it was better that they were cared for and I could just focus on myself.
Oh, absolutely. And also it was helpful that Mandy's husband was with their older son, Max, and Lorena's husband was with Sebastian. So at least, however many child wranglers and babysitters we could get, we really appreciated at that time. And it turned out that Mandy arrived first to begin to prepare and set up, and I arrived shortly thereafter and worked with Jackie, who is the head of the Arts Council, to try and take care of as many details as possible so that Mandy, Lorena, and Jonathan could really focus on mentally and physically preparing for the performance. But of course, John, you still needed to make sure everything was sort of in place, especially the sound system.
Yeah, I remember there being a problem. Our plan was to run the sound through the library's computer, one of the computers that they had, and it just took a lot longer to figure out and set up than we anticipated.
Yes.
Like the computer itself just took a long time to turn on, for example. Just like little thing. We're like, oh, right, okay. And finding out the right configuration of music program to speaker to USB drive to blah blah all that stuff was surprisingly more challenging than I anticipated. So a lot of my prep time was focused on that. So again, I was so grateful that you could take over my speaking.
Oh,
In that
yes.
case too.
I was just trying to figure out what can I do to make it easier. And meanwhile, we knew that the whole event was being filmed by a local TV station. So I think it just maybe the pressure was turned up just a notch, perhaps. But I think, John, I want to focus on how you experienced various aspects of
Sure.
this last show. And first, I think for those of us who are not elite dancers or athletes, I know I have always wondered when you watch an athlete or a dancer who has been sick or injured perform, whether it's at the Olympics or something like that, anyway, and they're sick and they're injured, and you're scratching your head thinking, how are they possibly doing this? Well, I kind of was thinking about John in that way and wondering if you would tell us, you were determined to dance, and I'm thinking to myself, how are you going to do this? Do you think all of your years of professional training and experience enable you to do something like that? Where mere mortals couldn't contemplate it.
Mere mortals would dare. Absolutely. I mean, because of that, I am able to do it. But to speak more in detail about that, yes, no, I was confident enough in my abilities, in my experience, to say, okay, I can pull out a win, or at least if not a win, I can hit the target, and I'll be fine if I really can just focus on that. It's interesting because whenever you have to perform with an illness or an injury, it can actually be a really amazing experience and an opportunity for growth. Because you really do have to find subtle solutions to problems within your own body and your own mental state. It's a great opportunity to actually throw out some anxieties and really focus on what's important. And, like I said, had I been well, I would have said, okay, no problem. Of course, I'll still do my speaking part, which is a mild added stressor to me, and it might distract me from my physical preparation. But because I was sick, I said, look, I really have to focus on what's important. So I handed off that responsibility and really focused on myself and my physical needs. That's sort of an obvious example, but a more subtle one is that, like, all right, what is the essential warm-up I need? I'm not going to be jumping around the studio just to get my heart rate up and to feel like I can jump and bound and be in my most physical, like, manly bravura self. No, I'm really going to, like, zen out and focus in and say, what is at my core the most essential warm-up that I need? What do I truly need to feel prepared? What's the most efficient attack I can do with this movement? And when you work that way, you just sort of, and you're open to it, you can really discover new expressions through your body. And I felt like this very much was an example of that. It's interesting too, trying to sing with this sort of cold that has been lingering, this same illness that's been lingering. What I'm learning about my physical voice, the mechanics of my voice, to overcome post-nasal drip and cough, and trying to sing through a note when you feel that need to cough come on. It's not always about pushing through. Sometimes it can be about relaxing back, and then you discover, oh, that's really where that muscle is. That's really what that alignment is. Without an impediment, you're sort of free to move around, but when you have an impediment, you really have to find that perfect place to align or balance, or or to use tension in a good way. So it's like that impediment can kind of be like a training wheel.
Interesting.
And it's this immediate sensory feedback of, nope, it's not that. That's not the alignment. Because now you have, like, if you do that, you're going to cough.
Right.
So the real alignment is here. Okay. And it's the same in dance. It's like, nope, if you push too hard, you get immediate feedback. You get immediate, like, nope, that's too much.
Right.
Or nope, that's not enough. You feel it right away when you're sick, or you feel it right away when you're injured. So, gosh, it can be a powerful learning tool. Now, you want it to come at the right time. You don't want it to come when you're like about to perform at a Met Gala or something. But who knows? It could be the perfect moment. It could be the perfect moment to have that breakthrough. So, I kind of, in my career, have come to welcome things like that. When they choose to knock on my door, I say, okay, fine. And I don't back away from the performance. I mean, unless I'm utterly debilitated, of course, or infectious.
Well, it was interesting as you described the approach you took, because you told me that day you were able to focus almost exclusively, with the exception of the early sound system issues, on mentally and physically preparing for Embers and Ash, instead of being in charge of all the production aspects of the show, because still the Marionette Arts Council was technically producing the show.
Yeah, and they took care of a lot of that.
Yeah, exactly.
Or we did in advance and together and things like that.
Exactly. So, but it was interesting to me that you said you had not had that experience for whatever length of time, where you were completely mentally and physically focused on your prep and nothing else.
Yes.
So it's been since the Lamone days, you said, since that has happened. So what was that like?
It was so nice. Oh, it was so nice. Yeah, I felt young again. I felt like
oh my gosh.
Oh, I was listening to you speak and introduce us, and it was, it was like I just utterly trusted everything you were saying, so that, like, there was no worries there. The show was set up and produced, all that was done. I was just a dancer in that moment. The choreography was set. I was not a choreographer anymore. I just had to prepare my body and dance this dance that. So I could have been doing anybody's material. I could have been in any company. I was just a dancer. There was no other hat I was wearing.
Yes.
And it felt so good. And I've always kind of known that. I'm always trying to get hats off of my head come showtime, but it's never truly been the case. And so here again, the illness was a blessing in that respect. It gave me this fantastic nostalgic experience of just being a dancer, but it also sort of shapes my parameters going forward of what, if I am producing and choreographing something, just how prepared I truly want to be. I've always said this, but to actually physically feel it and have it happen, I'm like, right, that's what it means to actually have all the hats off and just be the performer that you need to be in that moment.
Interesting information for you moving forward about decisions, but we'll get to that in just a second.
Yeah.
But first, John, can you think of some highlights from the show that stood out to you in particular that you'd want to share.
Well, first of all of the pieces I think looked their best. It was, it makes total sense because again, we are all professionals moving forward. So it's like each time it should be at least somewhat better, if not much better. But it was nice to even see Mandy and Laurie's pieces, which we had sort of tabled for a little while we focused on premiering Brittle Branches, to see them come back and really be at a higher level than they were. And it's a testament to Mandy and Laurie's artistry, both of them as dancers and choreographers, that with just a few rehearsals, some well thought out notes, the pieces came back, and they came back richer. Which is what you always hope for, and I think at a professional level can come to expect, kind of. I mean, yes and no, or it's also totally reasonable to say like, well, it's been a while, so it makes sense that the piece isn't at its best. But I don't know, it made sense to me, but it was just so lovely to see. Like, of course it was. It's like you got to watch great dancers doing great things. So I loved that aspect. And then coming to my own pieces, I was also pleasantly pleasantly surprised that they both had grown. It felt so good to come back to Embers and Ash and perform it. I haven't seen the video yet, but it just felt like a great performance of it for me. I really hope it looks as good as it felt. And then watching Brittle Branches again with the subtle changes that I had made, what that did.
Right.
But again, kind of a nostalgic, sentimental moment I had was watching Laurie and Mandy perform it. I was taken aback by how rich their performances were. We talked about the premiere at the Emmeline a few weeks ago, which just blew the piece through the roof for me in terms of its progress and its development. And it was just so nice to see them now do it in an informal setting and still, even without the lights and the nerves of a big audience, and that energy it can give you, they still brought a richness to the dance. So it's almost like now that emotional richness is locked in. It's in their bones.
Great point.
And even in an informal setting, they're going to deliver that.
Yes.
And they delivered it in an even more nuanced way, I think, because you don't have the nerves of the premiere, because the intimate setting lets you be just a little more relaxed. If you let it, you can go deeper, and I really felt like I was experiencing that with them. And I then had that taken aback moment of, and this is maybe the last time they're going to do it, or it's the last time we know that they're going to perform this. And I got a little choked up. About it.
Well, that was going to be one of my next questions. As we had just discussed earlier in this video cast, you were thinking preliminarily about how you would feel about this upcoming transition, and here was, likely Second Story's last show.
Yeah.
How did that inform the experiences you just described? Was that a top of mind thought,
No.
or more subtle background?
Like I said, it just sort of popped into my mind at that moment. It's not something, that we weren't going out with any sort of particular celebration. It's not like, like the reverse of a gala, like an opening night. Then you can sometimes do special things on a closing night. We weren't doing anything like that.
Right.
So again, when you're really just focused on the work, it doesn't matter if this is the first performance or the last performance. You're gonna have your notes that you think about. You have your preparedness to think about. You have, you're really just focused on the work.
Right.
So no, that wasn't top of mind at all. But and then as I said earlier, with the case in rehearsal, I was sort of taken aback that I was sort of emotionally open enough and to even let that idea creep into my mind, because normally, again, the focus is here, but I actually was able to, and I think it's also because I was enjoying the piece too. Like, so I was in this moment of like my mind was open and I was enjoying it so much, and then that sort of thought and emotion was able to creep in of, oh, and this. I hope it's not the last performance of it especially with these dancers, but but it might very well be. We don't know. We don't have those plans set out, and it certainly was the last performance as the Second Story Dance Project. So it kind of felt good to, at least within my own heart, acknowledge that.
Exactly, and I think we all did, and that leads us to a place in which we are now entering a transition period, and by definition, we need to allow the process to unfold. And so Jonathan and I will likely videocast less frequently, but we will keep you posted about both John's experience of this transition process and his ideas for future artistic endeavors in the various genres he has been currently practicing in: music, dance, writing children's stories, and who knows what else. We have to see.
Maybe I'll start juggling. I don't know.
Anything is possible. But we'll still be able to take you through how his initial visions start taking shape and how they are ultimately expressed. But of course, at this point, these are unknowns. So we're really in the process, and we thank you so much for being a part of our process thus far.
Yes.
And we look forward to your joining us for the journey ahead and seeing what it looks like right along with us. Thank you so much.